Hi, I'm Janine Firpo, and I'd like to welcome you to this, our 9th of 12 talks in the series leading up to the publication of my book, Activate Your Money, Invest to Grow Your Wealth and Build a Better World. Today, we're going to be talking about philanthropy, and we're going to be talking about two very interesting opportunities within philanthropy. One is giving circles, and the other is something called donor-advised funds, which many people have not heard of, but it's a really interesting financial vehicle that wealthier people have been using for a long time to maximize your philanthropy. And the two guests that I have today are experts on these topics. First, we're going to have Sara Lomelin, who is the Executive Director of Philanthropy Together, talking to us about giving circles. And then we're going to have Samantha Penabad, who is the co-founder of the Giving Fund, talking to us a little bit about donor-advised funds, or DAFs, as they are more commonly known. So I'd like to welcome both Sara and Samantha to our chat today. Hi, ladies.
Hi, Janine. So happy to be here.
Hi, it's good to see you both.
Nice to have you. So Sara, let's start with you a little bit. I know that you're absolutely passionate about giving circles, and you and a small team that you were involved with wrote some really nice content for the book and for this chapter, which I'd really like to thank you for. But I'd love to have you share a little bit about what makes you so excited about this kind of giving, and a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Thank you, Janine. For me, giving circles are the perfect entry door into philanthropy for a lot of people, right? It's a model that it's fun, is flexible, is easy. So it's a perfect way of learning about giving. A little bit about myself, I am originally from Mexico City, have been in the country, in the US for about 25 years. And I have been in philanthropy and working with giving circles for the last 10 years. I'm going to pass it to you again. I don't want to take too much time right now.
Wonderful. Well, we'll dig more into what you've done, both previously and also what you're doing with Philanthropy Together. So Samantha, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what is the Giving Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have danced around in similar circles. I know the book that you've written, Janine, covers all different types of interesting finance vehicles. I myself have worked in impact investing. I've worked with groups that have helped 401ks become more sustainable, more socially aware. But right now, I'm working with Giving Fund. It's an organization I founded about 3 years ago. And our focus is really on helping people give more and give more strategically. We were looking at our friends, our family members, folks, as Sara mentioned, who want to get engaged in philanthropy, but we felt like there were a lot of tools that were only for the super wealthy. And so Giving Fund is about helping people, regardless of your income level, really get engaged with philanthropy. So super excited about this conversation today.
That's great. Well, like a lot of people, I've always been pretty reactive with my philanthropy, even up until the point that I started writing this book, I would say. So a friend would contact me and say, I'm doing XYZ, or I am on the board of this organization, or raising funds, or some type of disaster would happen somewhere in the world and I'd feel compelled to give. And I've come to realize that wealthier people often are much more strategic about their giving. And both of you, I know, are working to help make that happen. And not only make that happen for more people, but really democratize the whole way that people think about philanthropy, which is great. And just an aside, Samantha, you mentioned the work that you had done on the 401ks and trying to help people understand how they could work with their employers to make sure that their 401ks include values-aligned investment vehicles. And I don't know if you know this, but you and that work was absolutely the inspiration for me to include that kind of content in the book. So a forthcoming session in chat will be about our retirement funds and how we can move those assets into alignment with our values. So thank you for that inspiration. I don't know that you knew that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Sara, you often talk about democratizing philanthropy. So what does that really mean to you? What does it mean to democratize philanthropy? And what are you doing with Philanthropy Together to try to make that happen?
Thank you, Janine. So Philanthropy Together, is the brainchild of more than 100 people. The collective giving movement in the US started about, in the 80s. And really, per the last research, there are about 1,600 giving circles in the US. So, we have this movement of everyday givers coming together, as you said, talking about values, sharing a vision, pulling their donations and really investing in usually small grassroots nonprofits that are usually invisible to traditional philanthropy. For us, democratizing philanthropy means to change the narrative of who a philanthropist is. You don't have to be, a millionaire. You don't have to be, in your 60s or very advanced in your career to be a philanthropist. You can be in your early 20s, just starting your career, and be a philanthropist. Philanthropy is not about wealth, it's about generosity. So we want to go back to the root of the word, philanthropy, love of humanity. And that is the way we are, envisioning giving circles. So the mission of Philanthropy Together is to democratize and diversify philanthropy through the power of giving circles. Again, why have giving circles started and blossoming all over not only the US but all over the world is because if you start reading some research, there are just a few dollars going to women's and girls causes, women's of color and girl of color causes, the LGBTQ community, etc., etc. So the giving circles, are coming together to say there are many things that I cannot control, but who to give, that I can control. And what better way of doing it, together in a group, in a familial setting, right? Because that's what giving circles are. They create, this sisterhood of people coming together to give.
It's so interesting that you say that a lot of women and minorities and other types of groups are underserved in terms of getting philanthropic capital. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that before. Shame on me for that, because in a lot of the book, I mean, I actually talk about, and when I'm speaking, I talk often about how our investment dollars are not going to support women, girls, and underserved populations either. So it's interesting that that's a problem in philanthropy. Now, you've talked about giving circles a couple of times. I'd like you to back up for a minute and explain what one of these is and how it works, because my guess is that a lot of people who are listening maybe have never heard of the concept before. So how does a giving circle actually work?
Perfect. So a giving circle is a group of like-minded individuals that come together to create change. There are, 5 different things that need to happen for you to have a giving circle. First, you gather, right? You start with people. You need people to create the giving circle. So you have this group of people that will come together and they will share their values. That's the second part. This group will, engage in discourse and talking about different perspectives. So each of the members of the giving circle share their own personal values, the values that guide their giving, and they come up with the values of the group. They decide on a cause that they want to support, and they pool their donations as a group to support that cause. They also discuss about different nonprofit organizations or projects or initiatives that are working in that issue area that they care about. Then, they pull their donation and they decide where to give their donation, right? And then the last part is to engage beyond the dollar. And that is, one of the big differences between, crowdfunding as you were talking about, this reactive way of giving, and a giving circle. With a giving circle, there's the learning part about the issue areas and organizations that are working in the issue area that you care about, and the engagement beyond the dollar. So we always call it the 5 T's. So you share your talent, your time, your treasure, your testimony, and your ties. Mm-hmm. So, Giving Circle members, after they give a donation, we have seen that the way they volunteer, increases and deepens. We have seen a lot of Giving Circle members becoming board members of the nonprofits that they support, running for office, and just becoming a lot more civically engaged.
One of the things that I've realized recently is that I actually want to be more engaged with the nonprofits that I give money to. Writing a check, it's just not that meaningful to me. But I also am super busy. So having the time to volunteer is really hard. But I would imagine that through a giving circle, I could feel like I'm part of a community or part of something bigger than just writing a check. Is that true? Is that part of the experience that people have in these groups?
Totally. Actually, I spent before Philanthropy Together, I spent 8 years with the Latino Community Foundation in San Francisco, and I started the Latino Giving Circle Network there. And we saw that a lot of people will join giving circles when they were coming as newcomers to a certain geographic area, because of this sense, looking for that sense to belonging to something that's bigger than yourself. And yes, the great thing about giving circles is that you are learning from everyone. So maybe you don't have the time to volunteer, but just, by meeting those 4 times a year or 5 times a year, you are hearing from experts, you are hearing from nonprofit leaders, you are hearing from other Giving Circle members, and that is enriching you without having to go and volunteer. You get a lot more, burst in the issue area.
I know a woman who belongs to a giving circle. Hers is actually rather large. They have well over 100 people involved. And when they get ready to make their donation decisions, she will say to her friends, I'm going to be giving away $250,000 today, right? Because part of what you're doing is you're actually increasing the impact that you can have. So if you've got a $500 donation that you're making, or a $100 donation, or a $50,000 donation, whatever it is, it may not seem that it's going to have that much impact. But when you're combining with other people's money, all of a sudden, that dollar amount gets pretty big. And if you're talking about local, smaller nonprofits that are generally ignored, it can be an incredibly meaningful amount of money that can make great change. So I think it's a really fascinating concept. So let's say I wanted to join a circle. How would I go about doing that? How would I find one?
I love that question. And actually, we are launching tomorrow, April 14. We are launching the first global Giving Circle directory in partnership with Grapevine. So Grapevine is a tech platform for giving circles. And tomorrow, we will have this beautiful filterable directory. We have been working on that for the last, 6 months. And it has 2,135 plus giving circles. About 1,700 in the US, about 400 outside of the country. And you will be able to plug your zip code or the issue area that you care about and find a giving circle near you. In case you don't find a giving circle near you, you can be inspired to start your own. But what we want is, for existing giving circles to showcase what they're doing, to showcase those groups that they are funding, and also for people that want to join a giving circle to get in community with other folks to find a place.
That is so cool. So
Yeah,
please do me a favor and be sure, because I didn't know you were doing that. So please be sure to send me the URL and I
totally.
will put it on our website. So I've mentioned this before, but the book is coming out along with a companion website that will point women to a lot more resources. And one of the areas in the web is the What's New area, which is all the things that I'm starting to hear about that are happening since I finished writing this book in November of last year, right? And so I would love to add that to the website. That's really fantastic. And I'm actually, as a result of knowing you and thinking about this, it's an area that I'm thinking, I mean, I'm always interested in building more community. And so I've been thinking about maybe joining a giving circle as well. I'm really interested in the issue of homelessness, and it's a big problem here in the Bay Area. So maybe there's a giving circle near me that's focusing on that. I'll look for it. And I actually have one last question for you related to what you're doing in all these circles. How has COVID affected the giving circle movement? Has it had an impact? What have you seen? Maybe it's had no impact, maybe it's accelerated it. I'm curious.
No, this is a great question because, as you may imagine, one of the beauty of giving circles is this aspect of being together, right? Being together around the table, sharing a meal, sharing a glass of wine with friends, and then suddenly, the pandemic hit, and we all needed to go into the cloud, into the virtual world. I am happy to share that Giving Circles didn't skip the beat. Like, what we saw was amazing. As there's no bureaucracy in Giving Circles. We saw Giving Circle members just calling, picking up the phone, calling their grantee partners and saying, what do you need? Like, forget about that application, that grant application, forget about, any restrictions that we had in the past. We are here to support you. So a lot of giving circles moving towards, unrestricted, you know, unrestricted grants.
Right.
Everybody, learning. I think all of us had to learn, this new virtual world, right? Actually, we have heard from some giving circles that they are going to, keep adopting some of the benefits of the virtual world, right? Because this way they are able to get members that maybe don't live nearby. In some cities like LA, there's a lot of traffic. With last year, they got a lot more engagement from their giving circles because people were able to join the meetings because they were via Zoom. So I think what we saw during COVID was this big wave of generosity. Everybody was stuck at home thinking, what is mine to give? How can I engage in community? What skills do I have that I can, give to others? So we have seen an increase in giving circles, and especially a lot more diverse giving circles. I was telling you a little bit about, getting people inspired to start their own giving circles. At Philanthropy Together, we have an incubator of giving circles called Launchpad. That is for anyone that wants to start a giving circle. And what we have seen is, out of the 200 people that were trained last year in Launchpad, most of them, like 95 of those giving circles, are focused on racial equity and social justice. So for us, it's just a testament of how, everyday givers are just rolling up their sleeves and saying, this is what we can do together.
That's great. And one of the things I learned is that actually, if you combine all the giving that average people make over the course of the year, it outstrips the really big amount of giving that we think, we think the big foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and these organizations are actually the biggest givers in this country, but it is the actual individuals when our money is combined. So thank you so much for that, Sara. So Samantha, let's talk a little bit about donor-advised funds, which I, again, didn't really know much about them until relatively recently, but I find them a fascinating option. And I'd love to have you talk about a little bit what are they? Why are they important? Why would the average person want to know about them? And why did you start your organization, the Giving Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So a donor advised fund is a financial vehicle, I'll call it, that is registered itself as a nonprofit. So you can put money into a donor advised fund and immediately get a tax break from that, a tax receipt. So it doesn't seem like that exciting of a thing, especially if you're starting out in philanthropy. But I think if you apply that model to the average person, it gives you a couple different things, and I'll talk about those. So the first is a commitment device, and the second is sort of a centralization platform. So I think we all have this vision of who we want to be, this generous person that we see ourselves giving here and there and joining lots of different organizations. But then reality kind of happens, and it's not because we're bad people, it's just life comes up. So by using a donor advised fund, you can put a set amount of money into that fund and earmark it for philanthropy that you want to give away. Similar to how you might use a health savings account and put money aside for prescriptions or Q-tips or whatever that is, you're putting this money aside and really saying, this is what my commitment is going to be to nonprofits this year or over the next X number of years. The second thing that I think is really great about donor advised funds is that it also provides some centralization. So I think today there are so many different platforms that you can give, and the average person is giving through, Facebook. They're giving when friends ask for money. You mentioned, Janine. They're giving text to donate, and that's great because it's exciting people to donate and donating different places. But at the end of the year, you kind of think, okay, well, what did that all add up to, and what am I about? So if you give through a donor advised fund, you can actually make sure that all of your donations are tracked centrally out of the same fund. So you can see, wow, I gave a lot to education, or I gave a lot to social justice issues. Is that where I want to be giving? Do I want to change that at all? And it allows you to start to be a little bit more strategic with that. And then the last thing I'll mention, which I know you might get to a little later, is the investment side. So when you put money into a donor advised fund, it actually doesn't just sit there. So at Giving Fund, we take the money when you've put it into your fund, but before you've given it away, and we actually invest it in social community investments. So the time between when you put it in, when you take it out, we've already been doing work with the money. So it feels like you've had twice the impact because your money's been put to work in the community in the time that you've been waiting to say, okay, what am I about? Where do I want to donate?
I was going to ask you about that because I think it's super important. And your fund then is one of a kind of fund that I refer to in the book as impact forward, right? So many donor advised funds, and some of the biggest charities in the country, by the way, are the donor advised funds that are held by the big financial institutions like Fidelity, Charitable, and so on. And a lot of times that money, as it's sitting to be donated, because the money in a donor advised fund can sit for a very long time. There's no withdrawal requirement. So when you have a foundation, there is a requirement at a foundation that they give away 5% of their corpus or their principal every year. There is no such similar requirement with donor advised funds. My understanding is that on average, about 20% is given away, but that means the other 80% sits and is invested in something. And most donor advised funds just invest it in the same old, same old. Mm-hmm. So this whole book and all this work that we're all doing is about how do you invest in the things that matter to you. If you're putting your money into a donor advised fund and then it's just being invested in the same old way, it's sort of working counter to those objectives, right? So there are a small number of, but growing number of donor advised funds. I'm in one called Impact Assets, where your money can actually be invested in cool stuff. In fact, I can even put it into a for-profit. So I can put my donor advised money into a for-profit that I feel is doing really great things in the world, but maybe is not going to give me a great return, or maybe no return at all, but I can support what they're doing even though they're a nonprofit. So are you able to do some of that with your fund as well, Samantha?
Yeah, we are. And impact assets, which you mentioned, has been around for a long time. And they do this really at the top end of the spectrum in terms of being able to provide really pointed investment opportunities for folks. We thought about Giving Fund a little bit different than impact assets because we're focused on those individuals who are new to philanthropy and just kind of dipping their toe in the water. So we wanted our donor advised fund to be completely free. There's no minimums. You just sign on and start experimenting. And the way that we do that is we actually take the investment returns from those community investments and fund our overhead. So that way you're never paying for extra costs or transaction fees or things like that. But in doing that, we also have a little bit more vanilla investments than a typical impact assets organization. There are things like community loans to entrepreneurs or loans that fund housing initiatives or housing projects. But all those things, again, go back to Giving Fund to help us fund our overhead and make sure that we keep the product free, as easy to use for those folks who are just starting out.
So I want to just say how huge that is. It's huge. So for people who are not really familiar with donor advised funds, oftentimes they have a minimum contribution size. That minimum is $5,000 often. Sometimes it's even more. There are donor advised funds where the minimums are $100,000 or more. So these are not necessarily vehicles that everyone can get involved in. If you're not giving $5,000 a year away, then something that has a minimum like that could be difficult for you. It could be a hurdle too high. They also tend to charge about 1% fee for however much money you have in that fund. So the fact that you have no minimums and no fees is extraordinary and really, really admirable. And I just think that fact that you're doing this and you're making that available to everyone is so cool. The other thing that I think is really important that would be helpful for people to understand, I love that you talked about the commitment drive. The fact that part of what a donor advised fund is it makes sure that you commit a certain amount a year. Another thing that really works well for them is because when you make your investment in that donor advised fund, like let's say you decide I am going to donate $2,500 a year. That's my goal, which is, by the way, about the average US philanthropic investment. So let's say you say that, and let's say you also say, but my income is really spiky because some years I'm a consultant, I do things on my own. Some years I do better financially, some years I don't do as well. Hey, this year I did super well. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put 5,000 or 7,500 into my DAF this year. I'm going to get the full write-off for that full amount this year. And then I am going to let that money ride for a couple of years to cover my philanthropic contributions next year or the year after, because I'm covering myself for that because I made so much for this year, but I get the tax benefit this year. So that tax benefit is a huge boon. And it's a big part of why these donor advised funds have been used, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that a lot of times people will use Giving Fund in one of two ways, either making that big upfront donation that they're going to spend down over time, or actually the opposite, Janine, where they're saying, I want to start thinking about my philanthropy like a monthly cost, like I have in terms of my coffee or how much I spend going out. And so every month they put sort of $200 or $300 into their fund. So it's been really interesting to see the different ways that people use it, either as this monthly commitment device, or you're right, this way of sort of thinking about your taxes more strategically and getting out in front of that.
Right. And the other piece that we talk about in the book that we're not really going into today is putting your own investment strategy together, your own philanthropic strategy. And we provide some tools and examples on how to do that really easily. And I've personally found that to be quite beneficial, because now when people come to me and say, give to this, I can say, you know, I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's awesome. But I've made a decision that my philanthropy is going to these goals. And I've already maxed out. I know I've maxed out for this year. So thank you, but no thank you, right? It lets me guilt-free say no to things that maybe are not really in my wheelhouse in terms of what I'm trying to support. But, you know, the fact that you get this tax write-off has actually meant that in some cases, people, when they get a huge inflow, like if somebody sells a company or maybe a piece of property is sold, whatever, they get a huge inflow of capital for them. And they decide, I'm going to make a big philanthropic contribution to mitigate my tax situation sometimes. That will happen. And then the money will sit in these donor advised funds because, as we said earlier, there's no need to move it out. And that has created a bit of a controversy around these things, right? So some people are actually quite adamant that donor advised funds are a bad thing and we shouldn't really allow them. Other people see them as a great tool, as we're talking about here. And I'm just curious, Samantha, what your point of view is on that controversy.
Yeah, I've definitely heard this. I think that at Giving Fund specifically, we don't see that as much because we're working with younger donors who really want to see their money out there, want to be working with the NGOs, as Sara mentioned, not just sometimes providing money, but actually engaging with those organizations. So I think it's really about two things. It's one, making sure that when folks have donor advised funds, they're doing just what you mentioned before, Janine, of developing those strategies and being really active and thinking about how to put that money in play. Giving Fund actually has a quiz on our website where we help people develop their strategy as well. It's really fun. So for those listening in, definitely check it out. And then I think the other thing is what you mentioned before around investments and making sure that those investments are actually going to things that are helping the community, that are either green investments or otherwise pushing forth social impact and environmental impact. And I think that's a way to sort of get around some of this concern. But on my end, I think that donor advised funds are, a really great way to get people to start thinking more strategically, and if used correctly, can totally change people's frame of reference around thinking of themselves as philanthropists.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that I do believe there are people who are talking about putting some sort of requirement on spends, which I think would be great because I love these tools, but I really believe that they're there for us to use and that we should spend the money. And I try to spend everything I put into my DAF, I spend it every year. Right. So that's part of the goal. If we're going to truly be charitable, then we should give it away. We don't just put it in a DAF and sit it there. But one last question for you, Samantha, what are your hopes for the Giving Fund? And if you could have your vision in the next 5 to 10 years, what would that be?
Yeah. We're really focused on helping people give more and give more strategically. So what I would love to see is some statistics turn around. So right now, we see statistics that show as you gain more income, particularly between 80K and 200K, people actually become less philanthropic as a percentage of their income. And we think if we can get more people on Giving Fund, get more people excited about thinking strategically, about being committed to those goals, we can reverse that trend. And also make strategic givers out of people. One of my favorite quotes is from John Rockefeller. He mentioned, if I hadn't learned to give part of my income after my first salary, which was $1.50 a week, I would have never given a part of that $1 million salary. So in an ideal world, we'd see more people building that excitement, building that muscle around giving. So as they grow in their career, in their income levels, in their wealth, they're remembering those things they learned back when they were Giving Fund users and just developing their strategy.
Well, I'm going to bring this full circle, little pun there, back to the giving circles because I actually also heard about one that is got their children involved, and the kids are actually involved in helping to make the decision about which grantees end up getting the money. And so bringing your kids in early, having your kids be part of the conversation about what you're giving your money to and having them be aware of that is another way to do what you're talking about, Samantha, which is really getting this thought in early and helping people recognize the beauty and the joy that you get from generosity, which is the word that you used earlier, Sara. So I'd like to thank you both so much for being here today. I'd like to thank you for being contributors to the book and supporters of the book. I mean, it just amazes me as I look at the two of you and I think of all the other faces of all the other women, young and old, across backgrounds who have been involved in this project. It just makes me so grateful. So thank you both so much. And please keep up the great work that you're doing to democratize philanthropy. I really appreciate everything you both are doing. And that will bring an end to today's session. And it also brings an end to the second part of the book. So starting with our next session next week, we'll be moving into the third and final part of the book. And that's when we're talking about how you can engage with others to help you be more successful in moving your money, all of it, from cash to philanthropy, into alignment with your values. And we will start by having a conversation with 3 women who helped me write the book on financial advisors. When do you need one? How do you find one? And how do you find one that's values aligned? So join us next week if you're thinking about a financial advisor to get some tips on how to do that in a way that will make you successful. Thanks for joining us today.